Hello everyone and welcome to this 3 million webinar on EU citizens' political participation and representation. Today we're launching a new report which will explore some of those issues, and we'll have a research presentation first by our researcher who worked on this project, Carl, who is on the panel, and then this will be followed by a panel discussion with some of the experts in the sector, unpacking some of the findings in the report and also offering their own perspectives on some of the issues that we'll discuss today. But before I give an introduction to the issue, why we did this report and the actual report itself and the recommendations, I would like to invite Nicolas Hatton, the CEO of the 3 Million, to say a few words about the organization and about the place of the political rights campaigning within the 3 Million's broader work. So over to you, Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Well, firstly, I'd like to thank the founder who's behind this initiative. It's the Joseph Lantry Reform Trust. It's a very important project. A lot of the focus is on settled status, our rights to live. But there's one thing that's really important. This is our home. Yeah, remember this? No, it's probably. How can we be at home if we can exercise our political rights? While we're in the EU, we could vote in local elections, and these voting rights are being now guaranteed in Scotland and Wales thanks to their parliament voted for it. In England, the position is that we should be able to vote in 2021, but there's no guarantee beyond this. So how can we consider it to be our home if we can't contribute to the political process? A lot of people are becoming British, but it's not available to everyone. There's lots of barriers, including the cost and the fact that you need to exercise treaty rights. It's a complicated issue. Plus, there's also the issue of voter registration and the engagement of EU citizens. I think a lot of us don't feel that we can actually contribute to the political debate because we're not citizens of the country. So there's a lot of work needed. We need more people to get involved, I think. And I'm really delighted that with Alexandra, we're trying to push the debate further to create a conversation and make people think about this. We can only think about the future in political terms, I think, because otherwise we'd just be going with the flow, and the flow might not be going the way we want it to go. So I'm going to hand the speech back to Alexandra. We'll be obviously continuing our own campaign of the 3 million for physical documents and the end of the deadline for settled status, but the focus on political rights is the fight to have next year, no doubt. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicolas, for that introduction. So indeed, the political rights is one of the issues that the 3 Million is campaigning on, and especially we have to remember that in 2021 we have a lot of elections across the UK, and one of the main barriers to political participation that we found in our consultation in July that we conducted with the East European Forum, we have another report published on that, is the unequal access or limited information on political rights in the UK. So part of the conversation is not only to think about what the research, what the data shows on this issue, but also thinking about ways to actually engage people on this issue and to actually raise awareness about the fact that EU citizens can still vote in 2021, and this perhaps mobilizing EU citizens in 2021, in the 2021 elections, could perhaps be a good strategy to campaign for preserving the voting rights after 2021 in the future. So how this work started, it started really from after the consultation we conducted in July, well, on Zoom, on political rights with different EU citizens and members of EU citizen organizations, we found that more work has to be done on this issue, and we found that this issue of political rights, which encompasses representation and participation as well of EU citizens in the political process, was overlooked in politics, and of course it's not the main priority at the moment with COVID and everything else going on. So we started this research project. It was a short research project conducted in August and September, disseminated today, funded by the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust. And our main question was, what do we actually know about EU citizens' political participation and representation, and what do we still need to know, and what kind of recommendations can we put forward to researchers, to people who are involved in data collection efforts, to people campaigning on political engagement, and to politicians themselves, to actually make this issue not only more salient, but to actually know what we're talking about on this issue. So there are very many challenges in this type of research that Carl will go into more detail. But what we really want to draw attention is that we are, of course, preoccupied with a lot of issues at the moment, but 2021 elections are coming really fast. So we need to prepare to actually think about how we campaign around these issues, how do we target our collective efforts to make sure that everyone has a say at the local level in 2021. So now I will introduce Carl, who was the researcher on this report, and he will go through some of our key findings, and then I will come back to speak about the recommendations and how do we see this going forward before having the panel discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexandra, for introducing me. As you said, what we wanted to do with this research project was very much reevaluate what we already know about EU citizens' participation and their propensity to register at the local level. But we also wanted to do a second thing. We wanted to place all of those results under a finer lens and look at them from a regional perspective. So not only look at it on a countrywide level, but also try and see what are the regional variations, because that obviously has very, very important implications for campaigning, because we have limited resources and those resources need to be used wisely. So in a first step, we needed to understand where the big groups of EU citizens actually reside in England. And to this end, I'd like to show you figure 1. This is based on the ONS population by country of birth and nationality data, accurate as of 2019, and shows the shares of EU citizens across England. So perhaps expectedly and intuitively, we see a very big red cluster in Greater London. So there's loads of areas in Greater London where a large part of the population are EU citizens. And almost as we move to the edges of the country, those shares become smaller and smaller. However, there is a noticeable belt to the north of London, if you look at the map, where more EU citizens reside than in other parts of the country. And that belt we will come back to later when we look at the data. But this is just the first step to understand where more or less EU citizens live in the country. Now, what is the first step to participating in an election at the local level in the UK or in England? Alexandra and Nicholas already pointed out, it's about voter registration. So even if you're eligible to register to vote, you still have to go out and register to vote. And therefore, it's really, really useful to see how the shares of people who've actually done that step, who've managed to get onto the electoral register and therefore have this right to go out on election day, on polling day, varies across the country. And that we can see in figure 2. Again, this uses ONS data of electoral registrations by local authority, accurate of December 2019. And perhaps intuitively, again, this looks quite similar to the population data, which I just showed you. So again, we have a big cluster in London. So large shares of the electoral register there are made up of EU citizens. And as we move towards the edges of the country, where also fewer EU citizens live, makes sense, we have smaller shares on the electoral register of EU citizens. But crucially, again, let me point out this belt above London and around London of red areas. So we go from red to blue. As we go from red to blue, we go from high shares to lower shares. And that belt, again, will come in quite handy later in our analysis. So let's have a closer look. I pointed out the regional variation. And to this end, let's look at the 10 local authorities with the highest population share of EU citizens and the highest electoral register of EU citizens. So what this tells us is, for example, in Corby, in Northamptonshire, 29.2% of the local population are estimated to be EU citizens. I say estimated here, and it's a very, very crucial distinction, because our population data is survey data based on population surveys. So these aren't administrative data points. But that data point tells us that 29.2% of the population are estimated to be EU citizens. On the other hand, we have administrative data on election registers, from the ONS. So in Brent, 18.6% of the people on the register are EU citizens. And let me quickly talk about Corby again, and I think we'll hear from Lucy on our panel about this later, perhaps, because the IPPR actually did a very interesting report a couple of years back about Corby, because it's a fascinating case study. It is the local authority in the UK, in fact, I think, where most EU citizens live and most EU migrants live. And they did work on the integration of migrants and sort of local attitude towards migration. So I hope we'll hear about that later. Next to Corby, let's have a look at Boston. In Boston, 20.6% of the population are estimated to be EU citizens. And on the other hand, 15.6% of the electoral register, the registered electors are EU citizens. So the share in the population of EU citizens is larger than on the electoral register. Now we asked ourselves, is that actually intuitive? Does that make sense? More generally, if you look at this table, there's a disjoint in the sense that the shares on the electoral register are all smaller than the estimated population share. And intuitively, this is not what we would expect. Why is that? That's because the people who are eligible to vote and the people who are on the electoral register constitute a subset of the entire population. So what does that mean again? It means that there are non-native citizens in the population who are neither from the Commonwealth nor from the EU. So they are not eligible to register to vote. And that means that the pool of the people who can register to vote is automatically smaller than the population. And hence, if all groups are equally likely to register to vote, we would expect the share of EU citizens on the electoral register to be larger. So this is a counterintuitive result. Now, what we need for this to be the case is the share of EU citizens on the electoral register to be driven down mechanically in some relative fashion relative to the population share. How can that come about? So first of all, it might be demographic. So you're only eligible to register to vote if you're over 18, and it might, for example, be that there are disproportionately many under 18-year-olds in the EU citizen population. Here we come to the first impasse with the data. We cannot, with the data that we had access to, distinguish or control for demographic characteristics at the local authority level. And that is a problem here because we cannot control for demographics. However, if we look at the distribution of demographics across the UK and across England and compare migrant and non-migrant populations, we do think that it's fair to assume that demographic characteristics cannot drive this differential. So there are not that many more ineligible citizens amongst the EU group than amongst all other groups. A second possibility which could be driving down this share is simply that there is an estimation error in the population sample, and I will come back to that. If you want to read more about how we place caveats on that, please have a look at the report. But the fact that our population data is estimated places a big caveat on our results and might be cause for concern here, but I will come back to that later. Finally, what could also reduce the number of EU citizens on the electoral register is, of course, also that they might just not register at all, or loads of them might not register at all. And that is obviously what we want to find out here. So what did we do to have a look at this? We compared the percentage point share in the population to the percentage point share on the electoral register that are made up of EU citizens. And due to the estimated nature of our population, as I pointed out earlier, and due to the fact we can't control for demographic characteristics, we have to be very careful with the results here. Because small differentials might just come from these two factors which we cannot control for. So what we do here is we take these differentials and we only look at large positive values. A caveat I have to place on the results is that there is no direct interpretation to the differential between those two percentage point shares. The only thing that we are exploiting here is that if EU citizens were to register, if they were equally likely to register as other groups, there should be no large differential. What do I mean by that? Let me explain with the example of Corby. So Corby again here crops up at the top of the figure. So again, this reinforces that I think it's a very, very interesting case study and will surely be part of the debate later on. If we take the yellow bar and the blue bar together, that gives us the percentage point share of EU citizens in the population. The blue bar is the percentage point of EU citizens in the electorate, and the yellow bar is then the differential between the two. Now, if EU citizens are equally likely to register to vote, then we would expect a much higher proportion on the electoral register than there actually is. And all of these constituencies exhibit large positive values of differentials. And again, we only exploit the fact that these large positive values are not to be expected. There's no direct interpretation along the lines of this means that there is a 9 percentage point lower probability for EU citizens to register to vote. What we see here is that there are large differentials which should not come up if they are exactly as likely to register to vote as other groups. Overall, what this means is that, first of all, there is considerable variation in the local voter registration of EU citizens across England. Remember, I showed you figure 2, and we saw that there was quite a lot of areas to the north of London where there were actually higher shares of voter registration, but overall there was a lot of variation across the country. And again, the indicative result that we find here is that there are certain local authorities across the country where EU citizens appear significantly less likely to register to vote than other groups. And this is likely most pronounced outside Greater London, where estimates of the EU citizen population are above average, which is cause for concern. I spoke about the lack of high quality data. Based on the available data, we can only say that there are likely these participation gaps, and we can also say where these participation gaps are biggest. So for example, Corby and the other local authorities that I showed you earlier. But crucially, what we cannot do is we cannot tell you how large these gaps actually are or what causal mechanisms drive them. And in order to answer those questions, we would need better data. And I'm sure Alexander will talk about that later, and there will be panel discussion about it. We did a further step in our analysis and also asked the question, what about representation of EU citizens? So of course, it's one thing to go out and vote, but of course, it's also active political participation also constitutes running for office, being elected for office, and representing the views of EU citizens. And here, there's also very little data on local councillors that have an EU background. And what we did in order to fill that gap or start filling the gap is we contacted the top 10 local authorities for EU citizen share to see how many of their councillors had an EU citizen background. We ran some freedom of information requests or contacted them directly, contacted the council leaders. And there was a varying mix of results to this inquiry, and we actually only got one data point from this, but it's quite an interesting data point, I think, because it comes from Boston. And if you recall, Boston is the local authority with the second largest EU citizen share in England. And on the Boston Council, there are no councillors with an EU citizen background. And if that result is reflective of other councils, I think it's a result that should be taken with concern, and there should be further research into this, because we think that it's not only about participating yourself by going to the ballot box or even registering to vote, but participation also entails that you go into the political arena and make the points that are relevant for EU citizens. Yeah, thanks very much. I'll hand back to Alexandra.
Thanks very much, Carl, for outlining all the key findings of the report. So I think the full link to the report is on the chat for those who want to have a closer look at the data, and we'll also have quite soon on our website some of the data that we used for this research as well. Before I go into just very briefly in a minute outlining the recommendations, because I'm really keen to get to the panel discussion and ask what panelists think about this quite concerning picture on EU citizen participation and representation, I will run a very non-scientific poll now with the audience here. If you're registered to vote for 2021, just to see if there are people who are, all informed about this issue, or who are not sure, or who are not registered at all, if they're sure, just for the audience, kind of get an audience participation on that. Also, a brief reminder to add your questions on the chat. If you have any questions whilst the panelists are speaking, I'll get some live questions from Facebook as well as from Zoom at the end after the panelists speak on this issue. So let's see the results. So yes, it's a very well-informed audience today, but I have like a few people who are not sure if they are eligible to vote. So in 2021, the rights of EU citizens in local elections have been confirmed, and generally speaking, you can find all this information online, but EU citizens, Commonwealth citizens and Irish citizens can vote, and Commonwealth citizens and Irish citizens can also vote for the general elections as well, and there are different rules in Scotland and Wales, so it's all a bit confusing for a lot of people, but if you want more information, please do put it on the chat and I'll be able to link you with the relevant information on that. Just briefly following on Carl's report, those are our findings. So because we don't have a lot to conclude because the data is not very comprehensive on this issue and is not very high quality on this issue. We put across some recommendations because this is an important topic. We can't just say we don't have very good data on this, let's just drop the issue and focus on something else. And perhaps some of the political stakeholders could also help in actually having some efforts to actually collect good data to actually be informed on who to target in those voter mobilization campaigns. So we give in the report, you can see the detailed recommendations in each category. We give recommendations for data collection and research, notably for future data collection efforts to look at voter turnout amongst EU citizens. It's something that we don't have access to, and data, more comprehensive data on at least a sample of local authorities in terms of local councillors, and how do we, and think about this debate on how do we categorize people of EU citizen background within the diversity statistics, for example, and it's like an open question for debate. We have more on this, but I'll just jump to the next area of recommendations, which is for democratic rights campaigners. There are a lot of us in the sector who are campaigning either for mobilizing people in the actual elections or for voter registration. So we suggest, based on this insight from the report, to focus some of our efforts within those areas that we identify as likely to have a large mobilization gap, and focus some of those efforts in 2021, especially if our resources are limited in those campaigns, which usually are, I mean, always are. And but on political stakeholders, because an exercise that would actually have comprehensive results in this area would require a lot of efforts, would require better data collection. But meanwhile, until we get to perhaps the 2021 census or other data collection efforts to collect reliable data on this, we can at least look at widening our qualitative base of evidence. So we propose, for example, political stakeholders to engage perhaps the consultation process or an inquiry on this issue, to be able to invite submissions from various organizations and other local level stakeholders that could actually build a better, more comprehensive picture, especially around representation and what is done on that particular issue. So yes, you can find all the recommendations in the report. I will just stop there for the moment and introduce you to the panelists. So the panelists will discuss from various different perspectives, some of them researchers, some of them involved in voter mobilization campaigns, and some of them studying this particular issue of minority representation, but on other type of minority groups as well in the UK. And we'll have 5 minutes interventions from each panelist, after which we will just pick a few questions from Facebook. I see quite a lot of comments on Facebook about people not feeling represented. That's exactly what we want to address today through this conversation and future conversation on this issue. So first of all, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Elizabeth Popp, who is the Democratic Engagement Officer at Hope Not Hate, and currently on secondment at the Greater London Authority, the GLA, as Citizenship and Integration Advisor and Lead Officer on Democratic Participation. So over to you, Elizabeth, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Alice, Nicolas. Thank you so much for this very timely and important research, Carl and Alexandra. I say important because Hope Not Hate releases its State of the Nation, the Fear and Hope research every year. And what comes out of it is really concerning. One, that the fact that there is a lack of trust in politics in general, but a particularly element in apathy and lack of control as our democracy is put on hold during this pandemic. We also know that there is a rise in conspiracy theories and the impact that can have on community cohesion, on hate crime, and on the fabric of our society. But also that we have a recession and we have all the social and economic uncertainty of Brexit and the impact that can have on our communities. So it's very important to speak about these issues, but I think also positive, given that Danny Kruger has just published his report into how we level up our communities, an understanding that we can't go back to business as usual, an understanding that the emerging social contract that comes out of this pandemic has to have democratic, civic and democratic participation at the heart of it. And in fact, Danny Kruger's report speaks about England being a hub of innovation for democracy. So I hope that happens, and I hope they read your report. I'm going to look a bit into the recommendations with my civil society hat, having run some of the biggest coalitions on democratic participation in this country for almost 5 years, but also with my insight into local authorities and working with statutory bodies. So I will touch first of all on the lack of data. All of us here, and I'm sure our viewers also know, data is power. So why we don't have enough data is because there is a lot of, how to say, a desire to hold that data closely to the statutory bodies who manage them. And that's one of the consequences of the introduction of individual electoral registration, which I've personally seen how it has disenfranchised communities already traditionally under-registered and underrepresented. So we're speaking about young people, we're speaking about ethnic minorities and migrant communities, so including EU nationals, and we're speaking about private renters. And we know that EU nationals on average are also represented in all these groups. But secondly, it's also important because it's what you do with that data, right? So you first of all use it to organize yourself, and then as a civil society, or you use it yourself to hold politicians to account. And I can't stress enough how important it is to make sure that there is publicly available data. And I want to just mention the amazing work that electoral services are doing across the country, and especially in London, to make sure that awareness materials are available. And we have to remember that electoral services are really understaffed, really under-resourced, so they are safeguarding our democracy the best that we can, the best they can. So then the second element of this big scenario is civil society organizations themselves. As a British Romanian, I'm very aware of the fact that as a new community, we're not very well represented when it comes to social infrastructure. So who among civil society organizations can really educate and empower EU nationals to do this work? Well, first and foremost, those who feel confident that civic and democratic participation awareness is in line with their mission statement and does not breach charity law. I can't stress enough the lack of understanding that exists around civil society organizations being able to do civic and democratic engagement work. And then secondly, when it comes to the most important moment of being heard, voter registration and elections, going into the land of the Lobbying Act. So all the regulation that encroaches into civil society organizations to actually lobby for the policies that would make representation and participation better. No wonder civil society organizations call it the Gagging Act. So more understanding, more guidance, and better work around this would be really welcome. And I have a challenge for funders. It's really lovely to see the GRRT doing what they do best as usual and supporting this work. But we need two big pieces of research. One, on individual barriers to the participation of community groups. And I know that there exist some for some BAME groups, but none exist for e-nationals because we are not considered an ethnic minority. So some money should go into that. And secondly, what other soft points exist on the journey to full democratic participation? And I'm speaking about volunteering. There is some research, but not enough. I'm talking about sports and how you embed civic and democratic participation, culture events, so on and so forth. That would be really welcome. And I think the third thing that I will leave in with is this idea of we need to be in this together. We need to move past the Brexit debate of divide and rule. And as ethnic minorities and migrant communities, we need to come together around democratic reform. We've already spoken about EU Londoners and then EU citizens in the UK being left behind compared to their peers in Wales and Scotland, but it's more than that. If there's one thing we've learned from this pandemic is the importance of piloting automatic and automated voter registration. And most of us in Europe already know that. Why do you need to register? Why can't you be registered when you get your passport or your driving license or your national insurance number? But thirdly, and very worryingly for me, having worked with communities and for communities, is this introduction of voter photo IDs, which are proven to further disenfranchise underrepresented and underregistered communities. And we've just seen the Channel 4 report last night about how this was used for voter suppression. I'll leave it here, but I have so many more things to contribute if we do have time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Like a lot of interesting points in there, and I'm sure we'll discuss some of those. I already see some questions on Zoom. And yes, that the point about the voter ID and like photo ID registration and the photo ID when voting is quite concerning, especially linking to our other campaign that EU citizens do not get physical proof of their settled or pre-settled status. So perhaps that could be even more difficult for some underrepresented minorities and others to exercise their democratic rights. Without further ado, I will pass on to the next panel speaker from today, which is Lucy Mort, who is a research fellow at the IPPR. And Carl already mentioned that the IPPR already conducted a very interesting report on Corby. So I'm really curious, Lucy, to hear your take on our report and on the topic more generally. So over to you.
Great, thank you. And how to follow that impassioned contribution from Elizabeth. Great, right. Thank you so much for having me join you, and yeah, for allowing me the opportunity to sort of reflect on the work that IPPR has done and to think about some of the connections between your work and ours. I will draw on the Corby work. I will say that that work was done before my time, so I'm drawing on colleagues' words, so apologies if I make a hash of it, but I'll have a go, and then I'll talk a little bit about some more recent research that we've done in the Yorkshire and Humber region, looking at integration and immigration and experiences and views of that. So as I say, a few years ago, colleagues wrote a report about EU migration in Corby, which obviously has been very significant for this report, and they conducted focus groups with settled residents about their views on migration in the town. So I'll just say a little bit about what they found. So broadly speaking, the report found that Corby was an interesting case study to analyse the experience of EU migration, as it's found in this report as well. And migrants were referred to as the engine for the economic regeneration of the town. So the area's experienced deindustrialisation as a result of the closure of the steelworks, and industry has shifted towards low-paid sectors that heavily rely on an EU migrant workforce. And with this rapid demographic change that had happened in the area, researchers found that there have been challenges then for the settled community. So they highlighted three things. So one, that local people saw that increased migration had happened, but they struggled to see the clear value of it. Local people felt that employers got most of the benefits of increased migration to the area, rather than sort of communities themselves. And they also reflected that local people in these discussions, these focus groups, were willing to tolerate current levels of migration on the basis that there are clear expected behaviours that are fair and treat all residents equally, which I think is an important point. So there are a couple of other things that I just wanted to have you bear in mind before I move on to discuss some more recent work that we've done. So that report found that EU-born employees in the area were paid £3.70 less than their UK counterparts. So that highlights, of course, the economic inequalities, and of course, Corby voted to leave in the EU referendum by 60%. So perhaps indicative of some local tensions. I realise that's a broad statement, but I'll move on. So of course, more recently we did this study in the Yorkshire and Humber region, so the Communities Up Close report that was launched earlier this summer. And that looked at experiences of neighbourhood change, migration and integration in 10 areas in that region. And some of those areas that we went to, which are annoyingly in some ways anonymous, but I will generally say that they're kind of on your heat map, they're sort of the mid blue to pink and light red area. So there's a bit of a mix. And we selected areas that had seen a large increase in migration, relatively speaking. So they're not necessarily the areas that have the highest numbers of migrants, but they'd experienced rapid change in, say, a 10-year period. So, for instance, in one of the areas that we went to, their EU migrant population had increased 10 times in 10 years. The areas that we visited had seen these big demographic shifts in terms of the EU population. So we can see these parallels, I guess, with the Corby area, but on a smaller scale. So maybe sort of suggesting a direction of travel. These areas that we went to in the Yorkshire and Humber region had also experienced deindustrialisation and a shift in the local industry to lower paid sectors that rely heavily on an EU migrant workforce, such as food manufacturing, wholesale and retail, and warehouse and factory work. And like Corby, I guess EU migrants are a big part of the economic regeneration of these areas. And also, like Corby, talking to the settled British population, which is a big part of what we did. We spoke to around 250 people in the region. They've often felt like the regeneration and migration that came along with that tended to benefit employers and industry above local residents and communities, though that's broadly speaking. And I just want to draw out a few of the findings that I think sort of complement this report. So your report's obviously talking about political participation and representation, but I think there are links to be made more broadly about EU migrants and migrant participation in community life and the barriers to this, as Elizabeth mentioned. So in 3 of the neighbourhoods that we visited, we held focus groups with EU migrants from Eastern European communities. And broadly speaking, participants talked to us about working long hours, facing exploitation, low pay, and sometimes poor housing in cramped conditions. And they also spoke about the impact of Brexit and the mistrust and prejudice and discrimination that they found this had fostered in their community. And of course, the economic uncertainty that Brexit had brought as well. Despite this, I'd say most, if not all, were intending to stay post-Brexit, though they were keeping an eye on economic conditions. Because they and their children had made their lives here. So I guess that brings me to 2 points I want to make in relation to this report. So I think when we talk about political participation, we should be mindful of the barriers that people tell us restrict them from participating in the way they'd like to in their new communities, such as long working hours and low pay, meaning little money, time or energy to do so. And I also wonder if that uncertainty and hostility that Brexit brought has an impact on people's ability or desire to get involved in local politics and local community. And obviously learning English was a key issue that we found people to speak about as a barrier to participation. And I guess this is likely to be another factor that hinders participation politically. And given all that, I think it's really evident that it's in the interest of EU migrants to be able to participate politically and have their say and their views and interests represented. Which is why this report and the campaign behind it are so vital. And additionally, I think it's worth sort of pointing out that I think there's likely to be support from the settled British population, given research in migration and integration tends to emphasise people's interest in fairness and equality. So I think, that's a broad value that we can appeal to. And finally, I just want to reflect that this report and its recommendations made me think about how I include questions around political participation and representation in future focus groups with migrant communities. I think it's a really vital piece of work, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for your insight on that. And yes, I think like the barriers, it's very important to discuss the barriers to political participation, because as someone who actually practices what I preach on political participation and representation, I can tell that getting into or participating to an extent in local politics is not the most straightforward process for a wide variety of reasons. So thank you very much for that insight. Our third speaker this evening is Dr. Marina Fernandez, who is a senior researcher at the Migration Observatory. And yesterday, the Migration Observatory just launched their new report, Unsettled Status 2020, which again is very insightful on some of the challenges that EU citizens face in applying for pre-settled or settled status. So Marina, over to you, and we're looking forward to hearing your comments on this.
So yeah, thank you for inviting me, even though I should say I'm not an expert on issues of political participation, so probably my intervention is going to be a bit briefer. So I have also some questions that probably the authors of the report, which I find really interesting, by the way, could answer. So yeah, or the public or just other panelists. So the first thing that, overall, I think that highlighting the issue of political participation is particularly important because we tend, and also that I include myself in this, we tend to overlook issues of political participation. We usually focus on other dimensions of integration like labor market or educational, how the people are doing in education, but sometimes the issue of political participation is overlooked or is considered, let's say, secondary compared to other dimensions. And I think it's relevant, especially in this case, because European citizens have the right, at least for now, to vote in local elections, that we discuss this, and also to compare them with other migrant groups, non-EU migrant groups, how they are, if they are less likely to register or not. But first of all, I think, and I know that there's a huge data limitations that you explained at the beginning. The first thing that strikes me is the issue of the heterogeneity of the EU population. So at the end, when we talk about the EU population, I know that since Brexit, we tend more to talk about the EU like an uniform group because we are affected by the change of immigration policy. But at the end, it's a very diverse population, and it's usually articulated in terms of nationalities. So also the migration experience is likely to vary a lot depending on the country of origin. So, and also the stereotypes associated to each country of origin vary considerably. As a European, in this case a Spanish European living in the UK, but also I know that the situation of Europeans in other countries, it's noticeable that the stereotypes associated to each nationalities, like Southern nationalities, for example, or Northern Europeans or Eastern Europeans, are very different, and this is sometimes comes with different levels of disadvantages. So for example, I've read quite a lot of research about discrimination against Central and Eastern Europeans, especially after Brexit, and mainly to the Polish and Romanian minority. But I haven't read any research about discrimination against, for example, German or Dutch nationals. So probably the experience in the UK as a migrant worker, or even if you are not a worker, I'm just saying worker because that's the typical experience of the European migrants here. But as a migrant worker, for example, it might be very different if you are a Polish migrant worker compared to a Dutch, for example, migrant worker in the UK. And also the issue of obviously different nationalities, different identities probably makes more difficult the mobilization of political resources. At the end, the communities are divided along, let's say, I'm not the one I use the term ethnicity because ethnicity is a different thing, but you can say along national lines, so depending on your country of origin. So at the end, I assume that this is the main reason why sometimes mobilizing European citizens can be a bit difficult, because even though we see in the map that in certain boroughs and local authorities, the share of Europeans is very high, then maybe this a particular EU population is very diverse in that borough. So maybe 30% is Polish, 20% Spanish, other Portuguese. So at the end, they don't really share the same networks. And that means that they don't go to the same events. They don't probably participate in the same political events. They have different also levels of political knowledge, etc. So I find that with European population is particularly challenging because it's very heterogeneous and diverse. So sometimes mobilizing people towards a common goal, like for example, putting pressure on getting more representation. So having, for example, EU citizen representatives in local authorities might be more difficult because at the end, that depends on the nationality. So I guess that only, and this is something I imagine that you can test in local authorities, when a particular European nationality is dominant, maybe in that case it's easier. For example, if a local authority, I don't know, 80% are Polish nationals. So maybe in that case it's easier to mobilize the political resources because obviously these people are likely to share networks, also knowledge, etc. Also, I'm aware that the lack of data it's a major issue. So I think it was really important the work that you did, but probably also like trying to explain sometimes the differences that you describe of EU citizens, relate that to the particular EU group that is dominant in each local authority. So that relates to what I explained before. So maybe in particular local authorities, you find a particular pattern of EU migrants being under-registered. And this is driven by a particular nationality, maybe because I'm just using an example. Bulgarian migrants, for example, might have arrived later, and we know that in general, recently arrived migrants are less likely to be engaged in politics. So these are, I guess, factors that you clearly mentioned that in the report that you cannot take into account that because of the lack of data, but obviously issues like length of stay and language proficiency are key to explain the engagement in the political sphere. Also, I wonder maybe if you can discuss later or just briefly how you think EU migrants might compare with non-Commonwealth citizens. So Commonwealth citizens that they have the right to vote. So how is the participation? Are Commonwealth citizens more likely to participate or to register than compared to EU citizens on average? Because this is not my topic of expertise, so I'm particularly interested in that. I think that these were my main comments.
Thank you very much, Marina. And yes, I totally agree with the comments around nationality and how different stereotypes and how different experience of migration in general could impact your likelihood to even consider engaging into politics, let alone being engaged and successful in politics and being elected and so on. Actually, on your last question around how it compares to Commonwealth migration or other migrant populations, I would invite the next speaker, Dr. Nima Begum from University of Manchester. She's a research associate there because Nima published one of the key reports on ethnic minority representation in local councils. So she will tell us more about her work and how does it compare perhaps with the situation of around EU citizens. But just to mention very briefly, there's a 2016, I think, report from the Electoral Commission that actually shows that EU citizens are less likely to register than Commonwealth citizens, but it's the only one that I've seen, and I'm sure Nima will know more on this topic because she's really an expert on this. So Nima, over to you.
Right, hi everyone. Thanks to Alex for inviting me to be part of this panel, and thank you for sharing the report with me. It's a really important report that everyone's, I think a lot of people and a lot of different organizations should really engage with it, and we desperately need more data in this area. So thank you also for referencing our report in your report. So I work with Maria Sobolewska at the University of Manchester, and we have collected data on the ethnicity of every local councillor in the UK. So it's a slightly different group of people that we've looked at. So we found that just 7% of local councillors in the UK are from a Black or Asian or ethnic minority background, and that there's significant underrepresentation of Black councillors. So what I'll do, I'll talk very quickly about some of the things that we found so far in our in the data that we've collected, but we've also been doing interviews with ethnic minority councillors. So I'll talk about some of the potential barriers for engagement, especially among EU citizens. So local politics isn't always the hottest or sexiest topic, and there tends to be low engagement with local politics anyway, in different contexts. So we do find a significant underrepresentation of particular groups. So ethnic minorities, also only a third of local councillors are female rather than the 50% that you would want to see. So I think this this report by the 3 million is really important. and in highlighting the low registration rate amongst EU citizens. I also wondered, and I think we have wondered, how widely is it known that EU citizens will be allowed to stand and vote in the 2021 local elections. So I think there are a couple of issues that are worth highlighting. So we found that the geographical distribution is really important, similar to what you found in your report, that there tend to be more ethnic minority councillors or more underrepresented people from underrepresented groups being represented in areas where there's a greater concentration of ethnic minorities, or I'm presuming as well with EU citizens. But there's also other mechanisms that are necessary to support ethnic minorities, EU citizens, people from underrepresented groups to become involved. And one of those things is political party. So most ethnic minority and female councillors represent the Labour Party. So I have more questions than answers, I'm afraid. So in terms of EU citizens' engagement in politics at the local level, a lot of that engagement comes through joining a political party. So being involved in the local branch of a political party or an organisation. And in order to be able to run for election, in most cases it's important to be part of a political party. So you need to be able to organise within the party. Often you need the party machinery, you need funding and connections from the party, and knowledge and training from different people who will enable you to run and go on to win council seats. So there's not enough research on political parties and EU citizen evaluations of the main political parties. So I think both Labour and the Conservatives have done a lot of damage and have alienated a lot of EU citizens in different ways. And the other thing is I'd like to refer to is stigmatization and the way that EU citizens, particularly from certain areas or certain countries within Europe, have been represented very negatively. So one of the considerations that a political party or a local party, when they're making selections for which candidate they want to stand in a particular ward in the council, they might have reservations about putting up a candidate from an EU, another European background, or an EU citizen, or they want to, especially at the local level, they're more likely to want to put someone who is seen as local, quote unquote, and as being, and that is usually a barrier for ethnic minorities as well, that parties might be concerned that someone who's seen as an outsider, whether they're ethnic minority or whatever their citizenship is, will be less attractive to voters, and it might not be worth putting them up, standing them in those in certain wards, especially if it's a heavy Brexit voting ward. So I think that's in terms of representation. In terms of the political engagement of EU citizens, I think the vote, the result of the EU referendum and subsequent negotiations with the EU have really compounded feelings of alienation, and there are other people on the panel who are a lot more expert on this than me, and I think feelings of alienation can or feeling politically alienated also means, well, a lot of the time, a disconnection from your local community, and you, in terms of voting in the local elections, wanting to stand for election or to become a councillor, you need the connections and the feeling of wanting to make a change within your local community. But if you feel rejected by the politics of a lot of people around you, then you might not necessarily feel connected, or that you have something meaningful to contribute, especially when you've been stigmatized. So sorry to end on a sad note, but thank you to all of you for taking part in this debate. And yeah, it's been really interesting hearing from all of you, and I really encourage everyone to read the report that's been written.
Thanks very much, Nima, and I do relate to a lot of those challenges that you described in terms of the political participation. We had a question on the chat saying, I have not seen a single campaign promoting EU citizens' political participation and focus on EU citizens at the local level. I mean, I haven't either, and I'll be interested if anyone knows at the local level if something has been done in terms of political parties deliberately encouraging EU citizens to either stand in elections or voter registration drives. If not, wait for my 2021 EU citizen canvas. So joking. Maybe, who knows. So before we go on to the Q&A, our last but not least panel speaker is Dr. Patrick English, who is a lecturer at the University of Exeter. So I'll hand over to Patrick to hear his thoughts on those issues, and then I'll try to take a couple of questions from the Q&A or the chat, although I'm aware we're running a bit out of time, but we'll stay like 5 more minutes just to answer a couple of questions. So Patrick, over to you.
Yeah, cheers, Alex. I love that we've spoken so much about Corby tonight. It's great to see obscure East Midlands swing seat kind of areas getting a strong look in. So bang on with that. That's great. So as Nima and I sort of cover a lot of each other's research interests. So what I'm going to say is probably going to be sort of adding sort of nuts and bolts on to all of the great points that she has already been making. I kind of sort of like to echo what's previously been said about sort of the lack of data on these issues and how important it is that we get more data, and what an excellent contribution that this report and its recommendations, which I think are great, make in terms of that sort of charge and that push for us to get proper data on where sort of EU citizens are. Are they registered to vote? Are they engaged to vote? And are they represented? And these are all sort of 3 really important pillars that we just don't know enough about. And this is a really great contribution towards sort of plugging in those gaps. So I think some of the few sort of key things I'd like to pick up on. Why is it important that we sort of know where these citizens are and what sort of are they registered to vote? Well, that's super important, because if we don't know where they are and if they're registered, we don't know what factors sort of push mobilisation, right? We need these measurements to understand what kind of factors will encourage EU citizens to register and then to go out and vote. And sort of connecting this to some of my own research on immigration attitudes and sort of the EU referendum, what I noticed was really interesting was sort of the belt that sort of Carl was going on about crosses around, sort of goes through a lot of sort of dynamic areas in terms of leave and remain voting. Goes through the Midlands and goes through a lot of towns that voted heavily for Brexit. So we look at Boston over there, which has a really high percentage of EU residents, really high registration rates, also the most, I think, leavey area in the country. So it kind of cuts across a lot of those boundaries. It falls a lot nicer, though, onto localized attitudes towards immigration, which I was quite taken by when I looked at it. So my own research kind of says that attitude towards immigration and sort of impact of immigration in the northeast and the southwest is quite negative. In the southeast and London, it's very positive. And to sort of see that mapping quite nicely in terms of where the EU immigrants are and those attitudes, maybe sort of going back to what Lucy was thinking about, well, are the settled Brits thinking about these in economic terms and valuing the economic contributions the EU immigrants are making? So that's kind of really interesting from that perspective. Finally, as well, on knowing who the representatives are. This is something I do a lot in my research as well. Who are the representatives and where do they come from? This is so important because it really helps to increase mobilization of otherwise undermobilized, underrepresented communities, right? So if we have people from diverse backgrounds in positions of power and authority, this helps to legitimize these institutions among people from those backgrounds. It helps to reduce alienation, helps to improve feelings of belonging. And these are all sort of really important factors that we need to be building toward. So yeah, thanks for the report. Thanks for inviting me. It's been really great. I've loved hearing everyone's perspectives on this, and I'm excited to see what the Q&A brings.
Thanks very much, Patrick, for your intervention, and thanks to everyone on the panel for spending this quite late evening with us discussing political participation and representation. I'm aware it's almost 7 p.m., but there's still quite a few people watching on Facebook, so I'll take a couple of questions, and then if we haven't managed to answer your questions, I will have your questions saved anyway on Zoom, so I'll be able to email you individually with some resources or some answers to your questions as well. So perhaps one question, I will just perhaps read a few, like 3 or 4 questions, and then whoever wants to comment from the panel can have the last word, and then we'll end the webinar after this round of Q&A. So we have a question from Manlio. Do we think that this low EU citizens engagement in the UK is a general issue across the EU, other European countries, or is this issue stronger in the UK? I'm not sure if any of those who have the data, who work on the data, want to comment on this. Another question that's interesting here, which perhaps Elizabeth and also those who work at the local level could comment on, what can be done more to make participation in local authority level politics more appealing to EU citizens? That's an interesting choice of words there, both to vote and to become candidates. So like some suggestions there from those who worked on the ground. And then a question from Sorina: what is the process to go from grassroots campaigner or ordinary citizens to become a councillor or an MP? Can an EU citizen become an MP? How can our civil organizations and community organizations support and educate? What funds? Elizabeth mentioned that, and what resources are available. Before I hand over the panelists, one thing I can say is you need to be a British, Irish and Commonwealth citizen. You can't be an EU citizen and stand in national elections, but you can stand for the local elections in 2021. But I will leave other panelists to comment more on what can we do to support. And maybe something that relates to our campaign as well, maybe Nicolas or someone else wants to comment on this. What is the process for EU citizens to vote in future European elections? And also I would add also future elections after 2021. We already say it's still under negotiation, but what could can we predict anything about that in terms of the negotiations? So I think I will leave this here. There are quite a few questions about what can political parties do to engage EU citizen voters. I know Nicolas responded for one question on the Q&A, and we already discussed this a bit in the panel discussion. So with those questions in mind, who would like to start? Perhaps Elizabeth, one of the recommendations? Yeah.
Yes, a very important question. So I've just delivered the London Voter Registration Week 2021, which brought together all the 33 London boroughs and over 100 civil society organizations. And one of the things that came out very strongly was I co-designed and I co-delivered all the assets. So for the first time in the history of London democratic participation, we had assets in community languages that spoke, educated about the voting rights, about the ability to have a say in London. The second thing that we did, we'd make sure that whether you are a faith institution, whether you are a community group, a youth group, or a local authority, you actually have those resources to make available to your wider community through your community engagement teams. And thirdly, we emphasize the importance of political literacy. And that was through working with civil society organizations and with education institutions. And that was one of the milestones that both Scotland and now Wales are putting forward. Political literacy resources so that we can have a community, all our communities educated to critically think, speak up, and represent themselves, and then put political power and on all political parties, because Nima so well said they're all in the wrong at the moment.
So, thanks, Elizabeth, for that intervention. Now we have this cluster of questions around what do we know about comparisons in other EU countries in terms of like EU citizens there who live in another EU member state. What do we know about regional differences in the UK? Someone says, I get the impression that Scotland might have a higher political participation of EU citizens. Do we know, like, does anyone know, Patrick, Marina, Nima, Carl, do we know anything about this? If not, there's another recommendation for the data collection, but I just open up with this question because a few people are asking about this.
So personally, I do not know. Sorry, go on.
No, go on. Yeah, go.
personally, I don't know. I do not know about other European countries. We do have data on Scotland, and I mean, my intuition would be that because EU citizens have more voting rights there, because they can vote at different levels, and the rights have been assured, they would participate more. But obviously, we'd have to look at the data. But that is something that we can explore in the future.
Anyone else wants to add to this? Marina?
Yeah, this is just more a general comment that in general migrants are less likely to participate in elections. So I assume that this applies to migrants in all over EU countries, both EU citizens and non-EU. And also, like, it's important to consider the socio-demographic profile of the EU citizen population across countries. Because, for example, in Spain, many British citizens living there, or like Northern European citizens living there, are over age 60 or 65. Sometimes these people are less likely to engage in the local politics. So it depends on whether they are working, so the actual profile of the EU citizen population living in a specific country.
Thank you, Marina, for that comment. Does anyone else want to comment on any of the questions before I end the session with one simple question? So if no one wants to comment, we have this question here on the chat about how confident, so from Bart, how confident are you that EU citizens will continue to be able to vote and stand in local elections after 2021? That depends on our campaigning, and the 3 million is campaigning to preserve those local elections after 2021 and to also level up voting rights at the local level for all residents in the UK. So that really is under negotiation now. We have bilateral deals with Poland, Luxembourg, Spain and Portugal at the moment, but it's not very clear what will happen to the other citizens, and our position was always that we want those rights guaranteed regardless of how it links with settled or pre-settled status, just that EU citizens who had those rights before should have those rights after 2021, and we'll be running this campaign in 2021 with a lot more activities around mobilizing EU citizens and campaigning to preserve those rights. So thanks everyone for the conversation tonight. I don't want to carry on for too much longer because I know it's late for everyone and had a lot of discussion and things to think about. But I hope this is just the beginning of the conversation on those topics. A lot of us have done different activities, but what we need to do now is to really focus our efforts to actually do some mobilization campaigns in 2021 and show that this is an issue that EU citizens care about. You know, when I came to the UK at 18, I had no idea I could vote in local elections in the UK. It took me years to actually be, as Elizabeth says, in the right circles to actually be aware of my political rights. So I would hope that in 2021 we have a more informed electorate and hopefully also more comprehensive data to be collected from next year onwards according to our recommendations and the recommendations of others in the sector. So thanks everyone for joining on Zoom and on Facebook. I put the link to the report in the chat, and you can also see our previous publication on the consultation from July 2020 with the East European Forum on the Young Europeans part of the 3 Million's websites. You can see the publications at the bottom as well. So thanks again to all panelists. Thanks to the funders, the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, for funding this research, to Nicolas for being here and introducing the event, and everyone who engaged in the Q&A and on Facebook as well. Have a nice evening, everyone, and let's continue the conversation. Bye.